29 years and 11 months. That's how long I had been working at Meridian Financial Services when they decided my cycle had come to an end. 29 years, 11 months, and 3 weeks, to be exact. 1 month and 1 week before my scheduled retirement, before my pension would have fully vested, before I would have walked away with the full benefits I had earned through 3 decades of dedicated service. My name is Patricia Walsh, and I used to manage the core database systems at Meridian Financial. Notice I said used to, because on a Friday afternoon in November, after nearly 30 years of keeping their entire operation running smoothly, I was called into a conference room and told that my services were no longer needed. "Patricia, we appreciate everything you've done for the company over the years," said James Morrison, the new Director of Operations who had been hired 6 months earlier to modernize our processes. "But your cycle has come to an end. We're restructuring the IT department to better align with our digital transformation initiatives." Digital transformation initiatives. That was corporate speak, for we want to replace expensive, experienced employees with cheaper young ones who think they understand technology because they grew up with smartphones. "James, I'm scheduled to retire in 5 weeks. My pension fully vests next month." "Yes, we're aware of the timeline. But the restructuring can't wait for individual retirement schedules. We need to implement these changes immediately to remain competitive." I looked around the conference room at the faces staring back at me. James Morrison, who had been at the company for 6 months. Sandra Chen from HR, who had been there for 2 years. Michael Rodriguez from Finance, who had started the previous year. None of them had been at Meridian when I had built the database architecture that ran their entire operation. None of them had been there when I had single-handedly migrated the company from paper records to digital systems in 1998. None of them understood that the systems they took for granted every day were held together by my knowledge, my coding, and my institutional memory. They saw me as an expensive relic, a pre-digital dinosaur who was standing in the way of their shiny new future. "What about my pension?" I asked. "You'll receive whatever benefits you're entitled to based on your years of service," Sandra said, consulting her tablet. "Since you haven't quite reached the 30-year mark, you won't qualify for full pension benefits, but you will receive a partial payout based on your current vesting schedule." Partial payout. After 29 years and 11 months, I would receive roughly 60% of the pension I would have earned if they had let me work 5 more weeks. And my replacement. "We're bringing in a team of consultants to assess our current systems and recommend modernization strategies," James said. "Then we'll hire new staff with contemporary skills to implement our upgraded infrastructure, a team of consultants, to assess systems that I had designed, built, and maintained for over 2 decades. Systems that I could troubleshoot in my sleep, that I understood better than my own family. James, with respect, these systems are more complex than they appear on the surface. There are legacy integrations, custom modifications, and workarounds that aren't documented in any manual. It would take months for a new team to fully understand how everything works. Patricia, I'm sure the systems seem complex to someone who built them incrementally over many years. But modern IT professionals are trained to quickly analyze and understand any architecture. We're confident that the transition will be smooth." Modern IT professionals. As if I had learned my skills in the Stone Age and hadn't been continuously updating my knowledge for 3 decades. "What about knowledge transfer? Shouldn't we schedule time for me to document the critical processes and train my replacement? We appreciate the offer, but we think a clean break will be better for everyone. Fresh eyes, fresh approaches." Sometimes institutional knowledge can be more of a hindrance than a help when you're trying to innovate. "Institutional knowledge as a hindrance?" I almost laughed. "I see," I said. "And when is my last day?" "Today, actually. We know this is sudden, but we've found that extended transition periods can be disruptive to the team dynamic. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Today, they were firing me on a Friday afternoon with no notice, no transition period, and no opportunity to ensure continuity for the systems that kept their business running. I had been at Meridian Financial Services since 1995, when it was a mid-sized regional firm with 12 employees and ambitions to grow. I had been hired as a junior systems administrator, fresh out of college, eager to prove myself in the world of business technology. Over the next 3 decades, I had grown with the company. I had designed and implemented every major system upgrade, had navigated every technological transition, had solved every crisis that threatened to shut down operations. I had worked weekends and holidays, had taken calls at midnight and on vacation, had treated the company's technology infrastructure like my own child. I had built custom databases that integrated seamlessly with legacy systems. I had created automated processes that saved thousands of hours of manual work. I had designed backup and recovery protocols that had prevented data loss during multiple hardware failures and natural disasters. I had trained dozens of junior employees, many of whom had gone on to successful careers at other companies. I had mentored young women in technology, had served on committees, had represented the company at industry conferences. And now I was being escorted out by security like a criminal, with a cardboard box of personal belongings and 29 years and 11 months of institutional knowledge that they had decided was no longer valuable. "Good luck with the next steps," I said to James as I stood to leave. He smiled the kind of condescending smile that suggested he thought I was being gracious in defeat. "Thank you, Patricia, we appreciate your understanding, but I wasn't being gracious. I was being honest. They were going to need all the luck they could get." I drove home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, past the houses where my colleagues lived, past the coffee shop where I had grabbed my morning coffee for 15 years. I felt strangely calm, not angry or devastated, just curious about what would happen next. I had always been a methodical person, someone who thought through problems systematically and planned for contingencies. It was what made me good at my job. And as I sat in my living room that evening, drinking a glass of wine and looking at the severance paperwork, I started thinking about what Meridian Financial would face when they tried to operate without me. The core database system that managed all customer accounts was built on a platform I had customized extensively over the years. The basic software was standard, but the integrations, the data validation rules, the automated reporting functions, those were all my design. The backup and recovery protocols were documented, but the documentation assumed a certain level of baseline knowledge about how the system architecture worked. Without that knowledge, the procedures would be difficult to follow and easy to execute incorrectly. The monthly data reconciliation process required manual intervention at 17 different points throughout the cycle. I had automated what I could, but some steps required human judgment based on understanding historical patterns and anomalies. I had tried for years to get approval to hire additional staff to cross-train on these processes, but management had always said it wasn't cost-effective. The payroll system integration was held together by a series of custom scripts that I had written to bridge compatibility issues between the HS software and the accounting software. These scripts required updating every time either system was upgraded, and the update process was ... Well, it was more art than science. And then there was the monthly regulatory reporting process. The government required detailed financial data in a specific format, submitted by a specific deadline, with zero tolerance for errors. I had spent years perfecting this process, building in checks and safeguards and workarounds for the inevitable glitches that occurred. No one else at the company fully understood how any of these systems worked. I had tried to document everything, had written procedures and created training materials, but the reality was that most of these processes required experience and intuition that couldn't be captured in a manual. Over the weekend, I found myself wondering how long it would take for something to go wrong. Not hoping for failure, exactly, but curious about which system would be the first to reveal the gap between what management thought they knew and what they actually knew. I didn't have to wait long. The call came on Wednesday morning at 6:47 a.m. I was drinking my coffee and reading the news when my phone rang with a number I recognized, Meridian's main line. "Patricia, thank God you answered. This is David Kim from IT support. We have a situation." David was one of the junior technicians, a good kid who had been with the company for about 2 years. I had trained him on basic maintenance procedures, but he had never been involved in the complex system administration tasks. "What kind of situation?" "David, the database server crashed last night during the backup process, And when we tried to restart it this morning, it won't come back online. James Morrison is freaking out because payroll is supposed to run today, and we can't access any of the employee data. I almost smiled. The backup process was one of those procedures that looked simple in the documentation, but required understanding several dependencies and potential failure points. Did you follow the recovery procedures I documented? We tried, but the instructions don't make sense to us. There are references to check the integration logs for anomalies and verify data consistency before proceeding, but we don't know how to do those things. What does James want you to do? He wants me to ask if you would consider coming in as a consultant to help us get the system back online. Just temporarily, until we can get the permanent replacement team up to speed. I set down my coffee cup and thought about this for a moment. David, I'd be happy to help. But I'll need to do this as an independent contractor, with my own consulting rate and terms. What kind of rate are you talking about? I had spent the weekend researching consulting rates for database administrators with my level of experience. The market rate for emergency system recovery was substantially higher than my former salary had been. My emergency consulting rate is $200 per hour, with a minimum 4-hour commitment per day. There was silence on the other end of the line. Patricia, I don't think James is going to approve $200 an hour. That's way more than your salary was. David, my salary was for 40 hours a week of routine, maintenance, and administration. Emergency consulting during a system failure is a different service entirely. These are market rates for someone with my expertise. Let me call you back. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. Patricia, this is James Morrison. David tells me you're asking for $200 an hour to help us with this database issue. That's correct, James. That's my consulting rate for emergency system recovery. Patricia, be reasonable. You just worked here for 30 years. This isn't the time to try to extort the company. I'm not extorting anyone. James, I'm offering my services at market rate. If you'd prefer to find another consultant with expertise in your specific systems, you're welcome to do that. How long would it take another consultant to get up to speed on our systems? That depends on the consultant. Someone with extensive experience in this type of database architecture might be able to understand the basics in a few weeks. Someone less experienced might take months. We need this fixed today. Then you need someone who already understands your systems. And that's me. There was a long pause. Fine, $200 an hour. How quickly can you get here? I can be there in an hour. But James, I'll need a formal consulting contract before I begin work. I'm not doing this on a handshake. I arrived at Meridian's offices an hour later with the consulting contract I had drafted that morning. The terms were simple: $200 per hour for system recovery services, minimum for hours per day, payment within 30 days, and no guarantee of ongoing availability for future projects. James signed the contract with the kind of grimace that suggested he was in physical pain. The database recovery took me about 2 hours. The backup process had failed because of a disk space issue that had cascaded into a corruption problem when the system tried to restart. It was exactly the kind of scenario I had warned them about. Exactly the kind of issue that my documentation had referenced when it talked about checking integration logs and verifying data consistency. But I didn't just fix the immediate problem. I also took the time to properly document what had gone wrong and why, creating a detailed incident report that would help them understand how to prevent similar issues in the future. There, I said, handing James the incident report. The system is back online. Payroll can run normally. And here's a complete analysis of what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. Thank you, Patricia. I have to admit, we probably couldn't have resolved this without your help. Probably not, I agreed. Your new team will need extensive training on these systems before they can handle this kind of issue independently. About that ... We were wondering if you might be willing to extend your consulting arrangement. Just until we get the new team fully trained, I had been expecting this conversation. I'd be open to discussing a longer-term consulting arrangement, but my rates would need to reflect the ongoing nature of the work. What kind of rates? For ongoing system administration and maintenance, my rate would be $150 per hour. For training and knowledge transfer, $175 per hour. For emergency response, $200 per hour. James did some quick math in his head, and I could see him realizing that my consulting fees would cost the company significantly more than my former salary had. Patricia, those rates are going to add up too much more than we were paying you as an employee. Yes, they are. But you're no longer paying for my benefits, my vacation time, my sick leave, or my pension contributions. You're also getting the flexibility to scale my involvement up or down based on your needs. What if we wanted to hire you back as an employee? I almost laughed. James, you fired me 1 month before my retirement, costing me 40% of my pension benefits. You told me that my institutional knowledge was a hindrance to innovation. You escorted me out with security and told me my cycle had come to an end. We may have been hasty in our decision-making. You were certainly something. But no, I'm not interested in coming back as an employee. I am, however, happy to continue providing consulting services at the rates I've outlined. Over the next 6 months, I worked an average of 30 hours per week at Meridian, earning nearly 3 times what my former salary had been. I trained their new IT team, documented critical processes in much greater detail, and responded to a series of system issues that arose as they tried to modernize their infrastructure. Every time they called me for emergency support, I was reminded of how much institutional knowledge I had accumulated over 30 years, knowledge that couldn't be replaced quickly or easily. The monthly regulatory reporting process took them for attempts to execute correctly, even with my documentation and training. The payroll system integration broke 3 more times before they finally understood how to maintain it properly. The data reconciliation process that I had performed monthly for -1 years took their new team 6 hours of work and still produced errors that I had to help them identify and correct. James Morrison left the company after 8 months, citing the unexpected complexity of legacy system management and the need to pursue opportunities that better aligned with his strategic vision. His replacement, a woman named Lisa Thompson who had 20 years of experience in financial services technology, took a much more pragmatic approach to managing the transition. Patricia, she said during our first meeting, I've reviewed the consulting invoices from the past 6 months, and I can see that we're paying you significantly more as a consultant than we would have paid you as an employee. That's correct. I've also reviewed the incident reports and training documentation, and I can see that your knowledge of these systems is deeper and more comprehensive than anyone anticipated. That's also correct. So I want to ask you something. Directly, what would it take to convince you to come back as a full-time employee? Not necessarily in your old role, but in some capacity that would give us ongoing access to your expertise. I thought about this question seriously. The consulting work had been financially rewarding, but it was also demanding in ways that my old job hadn't been. Every call was an emergency, every project was urgent, every interaction was focused on solving immediate problems rather than building long-term stability. Lisa, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in returning as a full-time employee. However, I would be willing to consider a long-term consulting arrangement with more predictable terms. What would that look like? A retainer agreement. You pay me a monthly fee to be available for a certain number of hours, plus my hourly rate for any work beyond that commitment. It gives you guaranteed access to my expertise, and it gives me a more stable income than project-based consulting. We negotiated a retainer agreement that committed me to 20 hours per month at $150 per hour, with additional work billed at the same rate. It was an arrangement that worked well for both of us. They got ongoing access to my knowledge and experience, and I got a steady income that was still significantly higher than my former salary. But the best part of the arrangement was the respect. Lisa treated me as a valued expert whose knowledge was essential to the company's success. When I made recommendations about system upgrades or process improvements, she listened carefully and usually approved the resources needed to implement them properly. The new IT team began to understand that the systems they were working with were more sophisticated than they had initially appeared, and they started asking better questions and taking more time to understand the implications of their decisions. I worked under the retainer agreement for 2 years before finally retiring completely. When I left, the company had a much more robust and well-documented technology infrastructure, and the new team had the knowledge and experience to maintain it effectively. At my retirement party, the real one this time, Lisa presented me with a plaque that read, "In appreciation of Patricia Walsh, whose institutional knowledge and expertise have been the foundation of our technology infrastructure for over 3 decades. It was the recognition I should have received the first time I tried to retire. But here's what I want to ask you. Put yourself in my position for a moment. You've spent 30 years building expertise, developing systems, and accumulating knowledge that's essential to your company's operation. Then, 1 month before your retirement, you're told that your cycle has come to an end and that your institutional knowledge is more of a hindrance than a help. What would you have done in my place? Would you have tried to convince them to let you finish out your last month? Would you have offered to work for free to ensure a smooth transition? Would you have accepted the partial pension and moved on quietly? Some people have told me I was vindictive, that I should have been more understanding of the company's need to modernize and control costs. They say I should have provided my expertise at a reduced rate as a gesture of goodwill toward a company where I had spent most of my career. But here's what I keep coming back to. They made a choice about my value to the company. They decided that 30 years of experience was worth less than the cost savings of firing me 1 month before my pension vested. They decided that my institutional knowledge was a burden rather than an asset, and I made a choice about my own value. I chose to price my expertise at market rates. I chose to demand respect for knowledge that couldn't be easily replaced. I chose to insist on being treated as the expert I had become over 3 decades of dedicated service. Do you think that was the right choice? Do you think there's ever a justification for firing someone 1 month before their retirement to avoid paying full pension benefits? I'm genuinely curious about how other people would navigate this situation. You know what really gets to me? It's not just that they fired me to save money. It's that they were so confident that their systems would continue working without me, that 30 years of experience could be easily replaced by a team of consultants and some fresh-faced IT graduates. They thought institutional knowledge was a liability. They discovered it was their most valuable asset. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if they had just let me finish out my last month, if they had allowed me to retire with dignity and full benefits. Would I have been willing to consult for them at a lower rate? Would I have been more generous with my time and knowledge? Maybe, but they chose to treat me as disposable, and they learned exactly what happens when you discard someone who holds the keys to your entire operation. If this story resonates with you, if it makes you think about your own professional relationships or your own capacity to protect your expertise when it's not properly valued, then maybe that's exactly what needed to happen. Maybe we all need to be reminded that our knowledge and experience have value, and that we don't owe our expertise to people who don't respect it. What would you have done in my place? How would you have handled being fired 1 month before retirement to save the company money? Tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about how other people would handle this kind of professional betrayal. Share this if it moved you, and remember that your own story of professional dignity and self-respect is still being written. You have more value than you know, and you deserve to work with people who recognize your expertise.